Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're watching this video, chances are you're fairly new to Blender and you want to learn ways that you can improve the quality of your renders. Perhaps you're coming from my previous video, Level Up Your Lighting, and you want to improve the quality of your cameras too. Well, you're in luck because in this video I'm going to show you how to create static and animated cameras. I'll also cover important features of cameras such as depth of field and motion blur, and by the end of this video you will have a really good understanding of using cameras in Blender. So let's get started. To add a basic camera to our scene, we can either come up here and click Add Camera, or we can go Shift-A Camera. By default, our camera should open up at 0, 0 on our grid, and then we are able to move it around in the 3D space like we would with any other object. We can also use this menu up here to adjust the position and rotation of our camera. Now, to actually look down this camera and see what this camera is seeing, I'm going to have to click this button right here. But as you'll see, if I click this button, it's actually going to take me to another existing camera's view in the scene. So before I go and click this button, I want to make sure that my selected camera is also toggled on in the hierarchy. So this is my new camera. I'm going to click this little camera icon here, and then once I click this camera view button, I should be viewing from that camera. As you probably noticed, when a camera is activated, this camera menu pops up on the right-hand side of our screen. Let's go ahead and look at some of the settings. One of the first things here is focal length. Now, this is a photography term. If we decrease the focal length, we get a wider angle shot, and if we increase the length, it has more of a magnified effect. But keeping it at 50 should be fine for most scenarios, unless if you're intentionally trying to create a wider angle or more magnified effect. Depth of field is another setting we want to understand because this can help us create more interesting and dramatic renders. So to create depth of field, we check on this box. We click on this little eyedropper here, and then we select the object that we want in focus. You see how that just went from being very blurry to very sharp? That's because we told the camera to focus on this object. Basically, this means that any object in the background or far away from this avatar is going to be blurry, and as it gets closer to the avatar, it's going to be sharper and more in focus. You can also tell the camera not to focus on a specific object, but instead focus on objects certain distances away. You see how it becomes more in focus and less in focus by using this slider. This is another way to achieve depth of field that isn't about one specific object. I want to continue talking about camera settings by talking about motion blur. So if we come to the render menu by clicking on this icon and then scroll down, we're going to see a setting called motion blur. When we check on motion blur, it means all cameras within this scene are going to render videos with a little bit of blur on objects that are moving. This little bit of blur is going to help your videos look a lot more realistic because in the real world, when you have a video, objects get a little bit blurry the faster they move. No object is perfectly sharp at every single frame as long as it's moving. So this is a very important setting to check on when you have any kind of animation in your scene. Unlike depth of field, the motion blur setting is not camera specific, which is why we don't see it in this camera menu, but rather the wider render menu. The same is true when it comes to rendering with the transparent background. You can't make one specific camera render with a transparent background, but rather you have to come down here to the film drop-down menu and check on transparent. This ensures that whatever camera you're rendering at, the background will render empty. While we're in the render menu, there's one more setting I want to call out, and that is denoise. Under render, there's a little checkbox that you can check on and off for this denoise setting. When it's checked on, it's going to make sure the camera automatically denoises your render, meaning that it's going to be crisper, cleaner, and less pixelation. It's very rare that I don't have denoise checked. Sometimes it can cause artifacts in your video renders, but I think that's pretty rare, so in general, I always keep denoise checked on. Now there's one more menu I want to cover with you before we jump into animating cameras, and that is the output menu. The output menu is going to help us set the resolution for our cameras, the frame rate, if it's in slow motion or not, and where the recording is actually going to save on your computer. So this menu is pretty relevant to cameras. let's start by talking about resolution. Currently, my resolution is set to 3,848 pixels by 2160. This is a pretty standard 4K landscape resolution. If I wanted to make this portrait resolution, I could switch these values and make 2160 on top here, and then it's going to be a 4K portrait resolution. So this is 4K, this is an extremely high quality render. I can also lower this so my render will go faster and so the image sizes won't be quite as big. I believe 2K resolution is 2560 by 1440. So this is going to be 2K, slightly lower, but still pretty good resolution. This is typically what I do for video renders. The last standard size that I use sometimes is 1920 by 1080. I believe this is called just full HD, and it's a pretty solid resolution. This is a typical screen size, so this also works for videos if you're trying to have your image or video render faster. This is pretty solid. When deciding what resolution to go with, it's important you think about how good of a quality you need for your image or video, how much time you have for something to render through. Obviously, the higher quality, the longer it takes. And then if you care at all about the actual file size of the images themselves. So that's completely up to you and probably will be a little different every time you go to do a render. Then below that we have frame rate. By default, Blender will usually set it at 25 or 30. I like to make sure it's always set at 30 because other softwares I use, typically this is the standard and it's just good to be compatible everywhere. So I always leave this on 30 FPS. This frame range relates to the timeline down here. Basically, this is going to tell Blender where to start and stop the zone that's going to actually be rendered. So if I were to click render animation, right now it would start the animation at 0 and it would end it at 170. I can also change these numbers down here on the timeline. We're going to talk more about the timeline when we jump back. We're going to talk more about the timeline when we jump into animation in just a few seconds, but the last thing I want to cover in this menu is time stretching. This is going to let us create renders in slow motion, basically, or fast motion, and how we're going to determine that is by treating old as a static value. So I'm not going to change this value at all. This is going to represent 100 keyframes on the timeline. Now if I were to double the value in new, it's going to make my render twice as slow. So within 100 keyframes, it's actually going to render 200 images. It's going to make it basically half as fast. So if we do this, we also have to then make our desired render window here twice as large. So if I was only gonna render 100 frames, now I have to render 200 frames. If I was going to render 200 frames, now I have to render 400 frames, because what this is saying is that I'm going to render out basically twice as many frames to make it half as fast. Now you can also do something like 150, which will make it a little bit less fast. I can't do this math right now on the spot, but basically it just takes a little bit of math to figure out if you are speeding this up, slowing this down, and by how much. And then you just have to make sure the render window here matches that. Then lastly, below time stretching, we have output. This is just telling Blender where to put our rendered images. So make sure you choose a file path that you can find easily. And that is the output menu. So let's dive into camera animation and more. Now, as you can see, I have a few different cameras animated in this scene. Let's first talk about this camera here and what's happening. This camera has 2 keyframes set up. A keyframe represents a moment in time and space. So at this point, at this frame right here, frame 20, the camera is supposed to be right here. And at frame 170, the camera is supposed to be right here. So at every single frame, the camera is at a different position. And the 2 frames I've set up myself are the beginning frame, so I placed a keyframe right here, and the end frame, so I placed another keyframe right here. And then Blender simply filled in the path it takes from it to get from one to the other. Setting these keyframes is actually extremely easy. I'm going to simply move the camera to the point I want it to hit, and then we click I on our keyboard, and location and rotation. Now this would also work if I rotated the camera at all. So just for demonstration purposes, I'll rotate it a little bit, click I, location and rotation. And now I'm going to see that my camera first stops at this position and then it rotates and ends at the end position. Now, as we were mentioning earlier, you might want to set these keyframes when you're actually in the camera angle view, because then it's going to help you focus on your subject and overall hit all the marks that you want to hit. So, for example, if I did something like this, that is what my animation would look like. This is definitely the simplest, most basic way to animate a camera, and I will say it works the best when you have less nodes, so it can be a smoother transition, and also if you're not doing too much with rotation, more just location movement. But this method does work. If you do use this approach, I definitely recommend you think of the camera motions a little bit mathematically. This is sort of hard to explain. It's a little bit more intuitive from my experience, but I guess the point is that you should be paying attention to the angles and positioning that the camera is starting at and ending at. So for example, if I'm starting at about -50, and by the end of the animation it ends at about -2, or let's just say 0, this camera is rotating about 50 degrees. So right about here in the middle, it would be about 25 degrees. So this is important because ideally you want to add as few keyframes as possible to keep the actual animation looking smooth. But if you want to add keyframes along this, you just want to be mindful of how much you're rotating and moving things so you can have a smooth transition. If you want more of the curvature to happen in the first part of the video, you can do that, have it happen in the second part of the video, but try to make that proportional, the number of keyframes in each movement proportional to how much the camera is actually moving in the 3D space. Now, if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it, but I think the more you work with cameras and the more you do this, that you'll kind of understand what I mean when I say think about it mathematically. So let's talk about one more thing when it comes to creating cameras with this approach before we jump into creating 360 cameras and focusing cameras on specific objects. So as you can see, when I click play or click spacebar on my keyboard, to start this animation, the camera starts off slow, it gains a little bit of momentum, and then it slows down towards the last few frames. Starts off slow, picks up a little bit, and in the last few frames it slows down. You might prefer that, but I prefer when my camera has a consistent speed from keyframe to keyframe, so let's fix that. If I come over here to the bottom left-hand side of my screen, click this drop down, and click Dope Sheet, I'm going to see a new timeline appear down here. If I click on my first keyframe, right-click, and interpolation mode, if I hover over that, I'm going to see some options over here. If I make it linear, now a green line is going to appear between my keyframes, and the camera should start and stop at the same pace. So this is going to create a very consistent camera speed, and this is typically what I prefer for my renders. Alright, now let's jump into creating this 360-degree camera. The first step of creating this type of camera is clicking Shift-A or Add, Curve, Circle. And it should import at 0, 0, 0, but if for some reason you don't see it, just reset these values yourself. And then I just clicked period, by the way, which zoomed me in on my object, focused me on my object, and now I'm going to scale this up a bit. Now it's important that you have your subject also at 0, 0, 0, so the curve you just created is exactly encapsulating this subject. The next step is to add a new camera, so again, add camera, and then we just want to make sure our camera is set to 0, 0, 0. Now we're going to, with our camera still selected, come over here to constraints. And we're going to add an object constraint. The first object constraint we're going to add is follow path. Now we can either click here and it's going to give us a drop down menu, or we can use this eyedropper tool to select the circle we just made. Now I'm going to add another object constraint, and it's going to be track to. One way we can do this is, again, choosing our object from the drop-down or choosing the eyedropper and selecting our subject, and that works fine. However, there is a way I prefer to do this, and I will show you why. So I'm going to delete that object. I'm going to come up here, click Add, and I'm going to add an empty, and I'm going to add a plain access empty. I'm going to set that empty to 0, 0, 0 as well, and then move it about halfway up my subject, and I'm going to have this empty be the focal point. And an empty is just, there's nothing there. It's just an object, a blank object that I can set the camera to track to. So now if I select my camera again, go back into object constraints, and go track to, I can actually make the target this empty. And what that means is now the camera is not locked in on my avatar, it's actually locked into this empty. And that's really nice because I could actually set up a keyframe for the position of this empty, just like we did with cameras. And I could move it and set up another keyframe like we did. And now I have the camera following this empty. So you can choose or not if you want to focus on your object or on an empty. But the final step to making this camera actually circle around this path, we're going to click on it again, Object Constraints, and then we're just going to click here, Animate Path. Once we do that, we should see that our camera now is circling around this path. And as you can see, because I set it up on an empty that kind of had this vertical motion, my camera is now going to do that as well. If this orbit is moving too fast for you, it's a really simple fix. We're just going to click on the curve, and then we're going to come over here to this little icon, data. And then under path animation, we're going to increase the frames. I'm going to increase it to 300 just to demonstrate. Now you can see that this camera is moving a lot slower than my other camera I have in the scene, which is 100. So 300, 100. If I wanted to make it faster, do 20 frames, and then as you can see, it's completing a single orbit in 20 frames, so very fast. This is completely up to you. I usually leave it at 100, but if you'd like to slow it down, again, we just increase this number. Once you complete rendering your video, if there's any kind of shakiness back and forth where it looks like the camera's just, the path is a little bit jagged that the camera is on, that's probably because the resolution of this circle isn't high enough. So you can keep it at 12 if you'd like, but again, if you render this out and you have issues, sometimes increasing this can help. So what this does is actually create more points on this line, makes it a little bit smoother versus if I were to set it to 5. You can see it's very jagged. So the higher the better. I think 24 is fine, but if you're still having shakiness in the render, feel free to increase it even more. And the cool thing about having a camera on a path is that zooming in or zooming out is as simple as increasing the size of the path itself. So if I make this a lot larger and I go back into camera view, now I can see that my frame is a lot wider here. I can also make it a lot smaller, so my zoom is a lot tighter. That's completely up to me. One more thing to note about the actual path is that we can animate this like we can animate any other object. If we want to have the path start over here, we click I, location and rotation, or location, rotation, and scale if we're changing the scale. Then we can come over here to a different frame and do something like this. Again, I, location, rotation, and scale. Or here, I'll just actually scale it up to demonstrate that as well. You can see that this curve is actually changing position and scale over this timeline. So that's going to create something that looks like this. Now this looks obviously very random. You'd have to be a little more calculated with what you're trying to do. But as you can see, knowing how to use cameras can make for some pretty interesting, engaging, dynamic renders. So there's a lot we can do with cameras to achieve the render we're looking. So as you can see, there's a ton that we can do with cameras to achieve interesting, unique, dynamic results. Alright guys, and that concludes this video. I hope you've learned a ton about cameras in Blender and have some ideas on how you want to bring this into your own work. As always, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and also visit my channel because I have a ton more videos just like this. Thanks for watching and good luck.